Hey folks, and welcome to the next part of Project Ensis. Now, I do apologise for taking so long on this one, but I think there's a pretty valid reason. Now, we just finished making this, which, as you've probably guessed, is a D5 pump bracket. But why did it take so long? Well, actually, during the prototyping stage, so these are some 3D prints of the same part. When I made this one, I test fitted the pump into it, and it turns out that I had made some errors. And actually, this bottom part of the volute here, this was scraping against the pump itself, and that's because I had set my reference point, instead of being the underside here, which is sunk, I actually had it the top edge, and that meant this whole thing was 2mm too shallow, which of course is absolutely no good. So I had to redo that, double check everything. I printed off a new prototype, and this one fits fine. And so this is the design that I then went with to make the proper acrylic one. And this was quite difficult because actually this whole internal section here is fully 3D machined. And there's a few little lines I'm not so happy with, but for the most part, it's really quite good. And once fluid's in there, you won't be able to see it anyway because it's behind a frosted layer. And also all the sort of lines and things do tend to get covered up by the coolant. But this is only the first part of the pump adapter. We also need a retention bracket which goes on this side behind the pump. And we're going to be making that out of 10mm aluminium. But to do that, we need a proper fixture, and that's what we're going to be doing now. So we've just finished making the first part. Now we need to take this acetal and we're going to turn it into a fixture plate. Now this is actually some stuff which I've had sitting around for a while now, and it's got a few pock marks in it on the back, so it's not really very good for making proper parts for. But as a fixture plate material, this is really good because actually this is a very flat one. It doesn't have any warping in it. So this is quite good for that purpose. So that's what we're going to do now. So we're going to get this on here, we're going to make the fixture plate, and then after that, we're going to use that to make the 10mm aluminium retention bracket. But to whet your appetite for the rest of it, we're not just doing the pump top, of course we're going to be doing the rest of the reservoir as well. And we need this so that we can get our D5 in that. But this isn't a regular reservoir, no. This is going to be fully 3D machined along the edges to make sort of like a blade contour. And that's going to be done with a little ball end mill. And then on top of that, it's got an inlaid aluminium section, much like the motherboard tray, so it should all line up. And then the really special thing is that the LEDs are going not around the outside like every other plate. No, they're going in the middle. And when I say in the middle, I mean they're literally going to be sunk into the back plate of the reservoir and are going to be sitting within the level of the coolant. I think that should be pretty interesting because the problem when having them on the edge is I want to have the lights go outwards. I want the outside to glow. But if your lights are on the outside, everything in the middle, of course, is not lit up. I don't want that. I want the middle to be lit up and I want the outside to be lit up, and I want the lights to be able to trail all the way around it. So I thought the best way to do that, rather than having double-sided LEDs which has all sorts of other issues with it, instead I'm putting the LEDs down the middle. So fingers crossed that will work out. But before we do that, let's just get this on the machine and actually make this fixture plate so that we can do the bracket.
Now that is looking really rather positive, especially with all the finishes on the sides and on the actual bracket itself. It came out really, really well. But now we need to make the actual distro plate. Now some of you may have been asking yourselves, why am I making an adapter rather than putting the pump inside the distro itself, because I have done that in the past. And the main reason for that is the thickness of the plate that you need. So with a D5 pump, the volute's about 13 millimeters deep or so, which means you need to be using minimum of 15 millimeter thick acrylic, or you might actually want to use up to 20 so that you can have some facing room in there as well. And that's the thing. I'm going to be using frosted acrylic for the back of this distro, which is where this plugs into. The problem with that is it's very difficult to find thick frosted acrylic already, and then on top of that, you can't face the frosted acrylic because then you take off the frosted finish. So you're sort of stuck with whatever dimensions are there, and they rarely ever line up with what you actually want. So by doing it this way, I can control this little piece, I can use a thinner piece of material, and it just makes it a lot easier to keep things nice and flat. Now, this reservoir is going to be tricky.
It was at this moment he knew. He f***ed up.
Well, it seems that my microphone decided to die in the middle of the segment. Fantastic. Well, in any case, I was about to say that this particular distro plate is pretty challenging because it has two double-sided operations and not just regular ones. The first one is fairly standard, but the second one involves flipping the part over before I've actually cut it out. So what I'm going to do is cut a rectangle out instead and then take all of my measurements from there, and then I can do the second side. And the reason for that is because I'm basically going to be milling a giant pocket from the inside, which means there's very little clamping area. Now I can't clamp on the outside because that's the part I'm machining, and I can't clamp from the inside using something like tape or other fixture clamps because there's simply not enough room. So to mitigate this, I'm going to be clamping around the outside of a larger piece and then milling down from the outside to do all the profiling, and that should hopefully do a good job of keeping things nice and accurate and also keeping the work holding nice and strong. For now though, let's just get on with the first operations for these parts, and fingers crossed everything will go smoothly. Now this is the part of the video where normally I wax lyrical about how happy with the finishes I am and how everything went to plan and came out just the way I wanted. Only this time it's a little bit different because it was an absolutely horrendous journey getting these parts done even as quickly as I did, and that's still a week late. And the reason for that is just so many tiny little things cropped up during the production of these parts. So the first thing that you may have seen in the community tab was the pump volute issue. And this was just a silly error. This is just me measuring from the wrong point on the model, meaning that this prototype was 2mm too shallow. Now I'd spotted that by making the prototype, so it's a really good idea if you're able to make prototypes before you do any kind of final work. But I managed to spot that, so that's all good and it works fine now. But that wasn't the only thing that went awry. So the milling of the acrylic here went, for the most part, pretty well. This particular one on Distro, pretty easy, nothing strange about that one. It was lengthy, but it all went to plan, and actually I'm very happy with how that all came out. This panel though, not so much, because it turns out that this acrylic is significantly thinner than it's supposed to be. So one of the issues I have quite often actually with Perspex in particular as a brand is that their acrylic often comes incredibly undersized, and this one is only 9.4mm thick when it's supposed to be 10. I'm missing an entire 0.6mm off my acrylic, and that's a big deal. So had that been used for a distro plate, that would have been a real problem, because that would have meant the whole plate was just considerably thinner, and it does vary quite a lot. And actually that meant because of these inlays, they need to be quite a consistent depth. And I can't really vary them from one side to the other. I don't have that capability on my machine controls, so I'm sort of stuck with whatever the surface is, especially on frosted, because I can't redo it. And that has meant that this part of the inlay is a little bit deeper than this part. Now it's not very noticeable because the inlay itself is quite thin, but I don't really like the fact that it is like that, and it does mean that the chamfers are a little bit variable. Now luckily, because the chamfers are very, very small, as I said, you can't really notice it, especially with all the lights on. But it's just a bit frustrating knowing that there's that issue there. Now speaking of the inlays and materials, I had to do them so many times. So first up, this is some of the aluminium from the inlay. Now this is 2mm aluminium, and it's stuff that I had in stock for a while, and it turns out it's pretty warped. I mean, this is horrendously warped, this one. And it came from an even larger warped panel. It turns out that's the last 2mm I had. I thought I had plenty of other sheets. So unfortunately for me, I had to try and make it work with this, and the results were pretty poor. So the first thing is this is the original inlay for the distro plate. And whilst it looks like it sort of came out okay, this finish is scuffed as hell. I mean, there's literally scuffed. It's got scratches all over the front, and let's not even talk about the back. So the finish on the aluminium that was already present was pretty poor, and the problem here is that some of these scratches are actually quite deep, and it would have meant that I had to do an awful lot of glass blasting to get rid of it, and that can affect the finish. And also because this is quite thin, it can warp it. So when you're doing the blasting, obviously it's like beating it with little hammers, and so it kind of does like goes like a banana like that. So having to do a lot of it on a thin piece like this, that's no good. So I thought I'd just remake a new one, and even worse, it was so warped that when it was cutting through, the center section, despite being clamped all around the outside, the center still kind of ballooned outwards, which meant that the chamfer mill cut very unevenly, and also when doing the tabbing operation it cut. So I actually had to use super glue to hold it down. You might just be able to see that in the video because I filmed this one, not the other one. And yeah, overall, that's a bit of a disaster, so I'm very glad I redid that. I'm probably going to have to redo that one again though, because the material is much, much thinner and a couple of the settings weren't so ideal. And I'd like a better fit and finish, so I think I'm going to have to redo that. And I had to take these off anyway to be able to put them into the chassis, so maybe I'll do that. It doesn't take that long to make an individual one of those ones when I'm not filming. But of course it wouldn't be the same if the other inlays also failed. Here's the first one from the warped plate. Yeah, that's a bit of an issue. This whole end over here was cut off because I got the coordinates wrong. But I say that I got the coordinates wrong. It's not entirely my fault, because it turns out I used my old machine coordinates thinking that they would be maybe only 0.5mm off after I redid the axis. Well, it turns out it's off by about 5mm. Well, that's about 5mm. So in other words, I probably would have been fine, and yeah, no longer. So I went and redid it. And this is the one from that warped plate down there. So the other one was from the original plate. And this is better, only it's the wrong size. And it turns out in the 3D model, this particular part, for some reason, didn't follow the parametric system. And I have no idea why. So I had to manually make a new one that fits, which is that one over there. I don't know why this is so big. I don't even seem to be able to edit the original extrusion any longer, so I have absolutely no idea why this one came out so much larger. It's about 4 millimeters wider than it's supposed to be. Beats me, so I got and redone that, but that doesn't bode well for some of the future parts if I'm not really careful and double check, triple check everything. And this was quite difficult to find out because the blocks are opaque in Fusion. It's easier to work with like that, so I didn't notice that this was actually protruding into the acrylic itself. So yeah, that's no good. Luckily, this one's fine. Now these were some pretty landmark parts because these are the front panels, and that means soon we need to assemble this whole thing. So the next part in this project is going to be machining all the remaining bits. They're not as intricate as these ones, so I'm just going to lump them all together, and then we can assemble the mod and basically have it mostly complete and ready for doing the wiring and the water cooling and all of that kind of stuff. So that's going to be a big one for the next part. Now, of course, you definitely wouldn't want to miss that, now would you? So make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you haven't already, because that is the best way to stay up to date with projects like this one, as well as all the tutorials, mod of the month, and of course we've got mod of the year coming up, and you wouldn't want to miss that either. Naturally, you can also find us over on Facebook, Instagram, builds.gg, and Twitter. We've also got our merchandise store linked below, so if you'd like to support the channel, make sure to pop in, have a look, and see if anything strikes your fancy. Take care, folks, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.